Hi. So I've just read a report, I think it was BBC Link, stating that the city authority in Munich has requested permission from UEFA to put the pride flag illuminated on their stadium ahead of the UEFA football match with Hungary, which I understand is tomorrow. This is intended to show opposition to what Munich and local people there feel is Hungary's homophobic policies, or more specifically, the homophobic policies or attitudes of the Viktor Orban government. Orban, of course, is a controversial figure. Um, there's no doubt about it that Hungary has more conservative attitudes on this than Germany, and that's clearly a difference between the two countries. But it brings about this question of sport and politics. Is a sporting event the right situation to express that sort of dissent? I've honestly mixed views on this. I'm not quite settled on this one because I sort of see both sides. On one hand, you could argue that there's always been political overtures in major sporting events to some degree. I mean, we can think of Jesse Owens at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Didn't do anything. All he done was his job as an athlete, but because he was so good, it obviously worked Hitler up. And you could actually visibly see the footage of the Führer shaking furiously. And there was a German athlete, I think it was Fritz Lunz, I think I'm getting that name right, who infuriated Hitler even more by being a good sportsman and by congratulating Jesse Owens afterwards. Um, but was that political? Not really. It was just two athletes doing what they were doing, but became political because of the historic context. Then, of course, there is the famous Black Power salute at Mexico City. I think it was the Mexico City Olympics in 1968, the Black Power activists. And there was a white guy from Australia, I believe, who actually endorsed that. I'm making this video spontaneously, so forgive me if I'm not naming the athletes off the top of my head. But that was another famous example. 1938, well, 37 and 38, there was two high-profile boxing matches, the world heavyweight title between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling. Now, that inevitably became highly politicized because tensions were building in Europe. Joe Louis was kind of held up to be representing American democracy, although, of course, that was a bit of a paradox because, this was still the Jim Crow era in the United States, and there was no shortage of racists who didn't like Joe Louis being such a good fighter. Um, but nevertheless, he was held up as a symbol of American democracy. Max Schmeling, although he was a member of the Nazi Party, a very interesting man, and certainly not an ideological fascist. And they had two epic battles. Schmeling won the first, and Lewis won the second, and they were massive events. They ranked among the most high-profile, anticipated heavyweight fights of all time. Huge events, huge events that transcended the sport. They were seen as kind of symbolic of something else. So hugely political. The Olympics have always had echoes of politics. There's, of course, a Munich terror attack in 1972. There was a boycott during the Cold War, 1980 Moscow and 1984 Los Angeles. Then, of course, 2008, the Beijing Olympics. There was real echoes of Chinese nationalism growing around that. I've quoted it a few times in my videos about that subject, where you had the torch relay going around the world and you had these clashes between Chinese nationalists, many of them overseas students, and pro-Tibet protesters and others. So that was extremely politicized. That's why I don't think it should be repeated in 2022. I don't think China should be allowed to do an international torch relay. Probably there'll still be echoes or at least remnants of the coronavirus at that time, so I don't think it would be allowed anyway. But in that sense, there's always been politics in sporting events on some level. The Olympics, especially because of the importance of it, because of the prestige of it, it's always had political overtures. The Commonwealth Games to a lesser extent. For example, Uganda's gay rights record became an issue a few years ago when the Commonwealth Games was held in Glasgow 2014. Um, when you have different countries involved and they have very different political systems and social attitudes to things, then sometimes, because of the high profile nature of an event, then there's crossover. Um, but in terms of whether a sporting field is the right place for protest, and of course, this has a contemporary context with the taking the knee symbolism and the controversy around that, specifically in England. Um, this thing about booing players. Boris Johnson has condemned that and he's urged fans not to do so. But I would say this, I think there are some on the left who have distorted that a bit and they have portrayed people who are booing taking the knee as being far right racists who are giving black players a hard time. Well, here's the thing, in football, there has been a problem with racism. You've had idiotic yobs making monkey taunts at players and officials and so on. That should be stamped out. It's disgusting. I don't see that as banter. I think it's disgusting. And I think in the 21st century, no player should have to put up with that. Um, on the other hand, the fans in this context, with the taking the knee, might say, well, this is the only way we can express dissent and disagreement to something we feel is inappropriate for the football pitch. Because taking the knee is very much associated with Black Lives Matter, which is a very controversial movement. Um, a question I've long had about this is what about players who might not feel comfortable taking the knee? What about, when Lewis Hamilton, the racing driver, urged fellow drivers to, I don't think it was taking the knee, it was another gesture to do with BLM, but what about athletes, sports people who don't want to show this sort of symbolism? They might be sympathetic to the movement, but they might not want to endorse the symbolism of it. Will they be given the freedom to do that, or will they face peer pressure? So, say for example, you have some footballers who might think, well, actually, I just want to do my job. I want to go out and play football. I don't want this to become the issue. Will they be given the freedom to have that choice? Because I think there might be a dynamic of peer pressure going on. So in that sense, it gets politicized. Now, in the case of this UEFA thing between Germany and Hungary, um, I don't know. On one hand, I do think the Hungarian government should face pressure and scrutiny for its attitude to gay rights, which don't really belong in modern Europe. On the other hand, flashing up the stadium with the pride colours, is that really going to change attitudes in Hungary? I don't think it will. Maybe among LGBT activists in Hungary, it will embolden them, which is a good thing. But will it actually change policy? I'm not sure that it will. I'm not sure that it will. And is it really appropriate? Because here's the problem. If you say that one form of protest is allowed, i.e., in this case, expressing LGBT rights, well, what's to stop some Hungarian Viktor Orban supporters from holding a big placard of him or banner, or even, having a big banner saying family values as they see it? Because if that is then banned, they would say, well, wait a second, one form of expression is being allowed, another isn't. Now, some people have criticised UEFA, saying that they're being cowardly and they are, by being neutral on this. But I'm just not sure a sporting event is the right place to express this. Um, I suppose it depends on the depth of the issue at stake. If there was a sporting event involving China, and pro-Uyghur protesters were to make some sort of demonstration condemning China's cultural genocide, I have to be honest, I wouldn't really take issue with that. Um, but I think probably the better way would be to protest outside the Chinese embassy, or in this case, outside the Hungarian embassy. I think the problem is when you bring it to a sporting event, it risks polarizing the movement. It risks polarizing the message because people might think it's just an attention grabbing stunt. So I don't know. I'm not going to condemn this move. I'm just not sure that it's the most effective thing to do. And it also creates a situation where you then have a dynamic of Hungarian side. I'm sure not all Hungarians support Orban. Let's say those who do. They will say, okay, well, they're expressing this. They've told a big portrait or a big poster talking about family values. And that will just then, gay people will feel uncomfortable with that and it'll just escalate tensions. So maybe it is better keeping it out altogether. So yeah, I've honestly mixed views on it. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think that political expressions have a place in sporting events? My gut feeling is if they do, there would have to be consistency. And the problem then is if you say, well, let's have consistency, then you allow this sort of back and forth situation that has no end in sight. Because to take the Chinese example, if weaker protesters demonstrate against China at a sporting event, well then you'll get Chinese nationalists waving the flag and aggressively promoting their nationalism, and they'll say, "Oh well, we're allowed to express our opinion too." So I think it kind of invites that situation. That's why I'm not convinced it's the best way to do things. By all means, show dissent, protest, but I'm just not sure that a sporting event is the right way to do it. This also applies in music. I'm thinking of a few years ago at the Eurovision when the Russian singer was booed because of Putin's policies in Ukraine. Now, that young woman had done nothing wrong. She couldn't help her nationality. She's just a singer. I thought she was actually a good singer. As it turned out, she came second anyway, so obviously didn't have an impact on the voting, but she didn't deserve to be booed because of what her country was doing. Um, so I'm not sure about that. I think you get into a realm where you sort of then open the gates for, well, any form of expression is okay. That's the only thing I would say. I'm not criticizing it. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just wondering, is it the best way to protest? Let me know your thoughts.